Good morning. I'm Kenneth Sean Mahies, a director of the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the launch of the Corruption Perception Index for 2023. I'd like to recognize the presence this morning of Mrs. Donna Jack Hill, Chair of the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, Mr. Ravi Surya Devara, Vice Chairman of the TTTI, Mr. Rajman Lal Joseph, Ombudsman of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, our distinguished feature speaker today, His Excellency Arif Kashani, Canadian High Commissioner, His Excellency Hernan Nunez, Ambassador of the Republic of Chile, Ms. Lisette Bloom, Deputy Head of Mission of the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, other members of the Diplomatic Corps, Mr. David West, Police Complaints Authority Chair, representatives of civil society organizations, international and local agencies, Messrs. Dion Abdul and Victor Hart, past chairs of Transparency, members of the board of the TTTI, members of TTTI, specially invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Before we present the CPI index results, we have our feature address to be presented by our newly elected feature address, and then the CPI index will be presented by our newly elected chair, Donna Jack Hill. Then we will have a short period for questions for both the Ombudsman and the TTTI chair. During the presentations, you may type your questions in the chat, or during the discussion segment, you may raise your hand virtually and you will be unmuted. In the interim, we ask that you keep your mics muted throughout the presentations. We at TTTI are pleased to give a platform for notable persons in our society to present on topics that promote the ideals of transparency and accountability in our country. Our feature speaker this morning is Mr. Rajman Lal Joseph, the Ombudsman of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. He is an established attorney at law with almost 3 decades experience in both public and private law. Mr. Joseph holds a Bachelor of Science degree in governance, majoring in public administration, an LLB and an LEC. Mr. Joseph is also well acquainted with public service, having served as chairman of the Standing Disciplinary Tribunal for the Police Service Commission, Teaching Service Commission, and Public Service Commission. He was also elected a judge and chairman of the Equal Opportunities Tribunal of Trinidad and Tobago, and he was also a member of an independent tribunal to review the detention of persons under the emergency orders. During his tenure as Ombudsman, which started in 2021, Mr. Joseph has been engaged in revitalizing the efficacy of the office of the Ombudsman. He is a firm believer in the importance of his office to the public and has been making notable strides in ensuring that the office of the Ombudsman advocates for public administration that is accountable, fair, and transparent for the benefit of all in Trinidad and Tobago. I now ask Mr. Joseph to speak to us on the topic corruption and justice.
Thank you very much, sir. Let me say to Madam Chairman of the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, Vice Chair Mr. Ravi Surya Devara, His Excellency Arif Kashani, Canadian High Commissioner, His Excellency Hernan Nunez, Ambassador of the Republic of Chile, Ms. Lisette Bloom, Deputy Head of Mission for the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, other members of the Diplomatic Corps, Mr. David West, Chairman of the Police Complaints Authority, representatives of civil society organizations, regional corporations and agencies in Trinidad and Tobago, Messrs. Dion Abdul and Victor Hart, past chairs of Transparency, members of the board of the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, members of the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, other specially invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning to you all. It is now my distinct pleasure to say a few words on the topic of corruption and injustice this morning. Firstly, when the word corruption is used, it would generally connote some type of unacceptable or debased behavior among public officials. By and large, this approach would be quite correct. However, I would like to examine corruption from a legal and socio-cultural perspective. According to Black's Dictionary of Law, corruption refers to depravity, perversion, or taint, an impairment of integrity, virtue, or moral principle, especially the impairment of a public official's duties by bribery. Furthermore, the word corruption indicates impurity or debasement, and when found in the criminal law, it means depravity or gross impropriety. Corruption also alludes to a fiduciary's or official's use of a station or office to procure some benefit, either personally or for someone else, contrary to the rights of others. It is also an act carried out with the intent of giving some advantage inconsistent with official duty for the rights of others. And this is termed an abuse of the public trust. Moreover, our own Prevention of Corruption Act 1987 stipulates in Section 3, subsection 1, that, quote, every person who by himself or in conjunction with any other person corruptly solicits or receives or agrees to receive for himself or for any other person any gift, loan, fee, reward, or advantage whatsoever as an inducement to or reward for or otherwise on account of an agent doing or forbearing to do anything in respect of any matter or transaction whatsoever, actual or proposed, in which the state or a public body is concerned, is guilty of an offense. What is noteworthy about that subsection, ladies and gentlemen, is that it is important that we focus our attention on the use of the words state and public body. Therefore, it is suggestive of the fact that corruption as a legal concept is applicable to the interplay between public authorities and the public or between public entities. This act seeks to punish the recipient and giver of bribes, and it is punishable whether summarily or on indictment to a fine of $500,000 and to imprisonment for 10 years. And in addition, people convicted of corruption shall be ordered to pay to such public body and in such manner as the court directs the amount or value of any gift, loan, fee, or reward received by him. Such person shall also be a judge forever, incapable of being elected or appointed as a member of a public body or of holding any other public office, and shall forfeit any such office held by him at the time of his conviction. Now, This act was passed by a special majority of the House of Representatives and the Senate, and it prescribed significant punishment for anyone convicted of corruption. Yet, our society is still plagued by this phenomenon, so much so that we have had instances where certain former government ministers, even an attorney general and former prime minister, have all been charged with corruption. The question that logically arises is, why is it that the corruption appears to be so pervasive, notwithstanding punitive legislation and the creation of institutions such as the Integrity Commission, Financial Intelligence Unit, and the promulgation of procurement legislation, and the creation of the Equal Opportunity Commission and the Equal Opportunity Tribunal, the latter being a superior court of record, charged with the responsibility of dealing with nepotism and general discriminatory processes in both private and public sectors. Yet, only recently in the Newsday newspaper of January 27, 2024, at page 4, a bold caption reads, quote, "Imbut, 6 billion in suspicious transactions in 2023, unquote." This headline emanated from remarks made by our Minister of Finance when he laid the Financial Intelligence Unit's 2023 annual report in the House of Representatives. Thus, notwithstanding our institutional creations via legislation, corruption and corrupt activities seems to be even more pervasive today. I now wish to deal very briefly with the socio-cultural approach to corruption, and I rely substantially on the writing of Dylan Carrigan in his piece entitled "Bobol as a Trans-Historical Cultural Logic, the Coloniality of Corruption in Trinidad." This writer asserted that in Trinidad, bobol, that is, corruption, fraud, embezzlement, is spoken of in conversations, in radio chat shows, in everyday situations, by politicians, and on the news. For example, during the Good Friday Mass at Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church on the 13th of October 2013, then Archbishop Joseph Harris said, quote, "Deliver us an end to bobol and corrupt practices," end of quote. And on the 6th of November 2013, the current Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, implored the nation to avoid bobol. Moreover, Senator Anthony Vieira raised the issue of bobol in Trinidad and Tobago Senate in 2014, stating, quote, "I would like to begin my contribution by talking about bobol. Bobol is a word that is indigenous to Trinidad and Tobago. Bobol is defined in the Trinidad and Tobago Dictionary, courtesy Cotilla, as several persons involved in scheme and covering for each other. In the Dictionary of Caribbean English Usage, the word bobol is defined as fraud and corrupt practices, usually on some scale by well-placed persons in authority in a company or in governmental administration. To be in bobol or to make bobol is to be profitably involved in a network of fraud, usually of a company or government official in collusion with others. Trinidad and Tobago has been described as a land of bobol. Indeed, bobol and corruption are like a cancer, causing social and economic injustice and discontent. Further, bobol as corruption was well articulated by our Calypsonians. For instance, Attila de Haan's 1937 calypso, The Treasury Scandal, the opening stanza was, quote, "I wonder if is Bob all, what they're doing with taxpayers' money at all." End of quote. This calypso represented a bottom-up view of the existence of state corruption in the 1930s colonial Trinidad. According to cultural commentator and social activist Afra Raymond, the calypso's outrage, quote, lay in the fact that the story came out in bits and pieces, and of course, none of the big boys were ever jailed or even charged for that theft. That was a massive amount of money in the 1930s. Attila was lamenting the lack of accountability and transparency in how public money was being managed. The Treasury scandal was a true episode from the bad old colonial days of the 1930s. But of course, we have progressed a great deal since then, having achieved independence, Republican status, and universal education. The problem is that despite the obvious movement forward, we are witness to yet another Treasury scandal. I am referring to the CLICO bailout announced in January 2009 and still ongoing at an anticipated cost of $24 billion, unquote. It would appear, therefore, that without meaningful accountability and transparency by public and private entities, we are going to be saddled by the perception that our society is characterized by widespread bubble. I now want to turn briefly to the role of the Ombudsman with regard to this issue of corruption. The Ombudsman, as you all know, is a creature of our Republican Constitution, and the Ombudsman derives his investigative powers from the said Constitution, but is precluded from undertaking any investigation into specific charges of corruption against individuals. However, where in the course of an investigation, it appears to the Ombudsman that there is evidence of any corrupt act by any public official or by any person in connection with the public service, he shall report the matter to the appropriate authority with his recommendation as to any further investigation he may consider proper. Now, that is the constitutional position which the Ombudsman is required to follow to the strict letter of the law. So that if there is a specific complaint about a specific act of corruption by a public official, I am precluded from launching an investigation into it. However, if it is that in the course of an investigation into public maladministration, which is the forte of the Ombudsman, I encounter, or any of my investigators encounter, any type of corrupt practice by public officials, I am then charged with the responsibility of sending that matter to the appropriate authority for action to be taken. So that is the full extent of the role of the Ombudsman in dealing with this concept of corruption. I now want to deal very briefly with the notion of injustice. And injustice can be defined simply as a lack of fairness. And from the perspective of the Ombudsman of Trinidad and Tobago, Section 94(2) of the Constitution gives the Ombudsman the power to investigate complaints of administrative injustice. But this power is restricted to public authorities only. The Ombudsman does not have the constitutional authority to investigate allegations of injustice within the private sector. Now, public authorities is a term that is broadly defined. It not only refers to the state sector, properly speaking, that is to say, government ministries, government departments, and public-oriented companies of which the state supports these entities in its entirety, or majority funding comes from the Treasury. Those bodies are subject to the investigative powers of the Ombudsman. Now, over the years, since this office was created in the 1976 Republican Constitution, all of my predecessors have published annual reports which were laid in Parliament. These reports account for complaints received and how they were dealt with. And since I have been in office, that tradition has continued, except that I have been constrained to issue and hear more summons than any predecessors in order to achieve prompt resolution of complaints. However, the formal court system in our country may need to engage in systemic changes in order to deal with the rising tide of cases, especially criminal cases, which proceed through the system at a snail pace, creating the perception of widespread unfairness. It is in this climate of bubble and unfairness that your organization, that is the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, has a pivotal role to play in bringing about a modicum of transparency and accountability, without which we may not emerge from the morass of corruption and injustice. At this juncture, I wish to thank you all for your undivided attention. Thank you.
On behalf of TTTI, I'd like to thank Mr. Joseph for his enlightening, thought-provoking, and quite appropriate address to us this morning. We will strive to work with your office, Mr. Joseph, and all right-thinking people to make bubble and corrupt systems and practices less of a culturally acceptable norm in our society. As indeed, wherever it occurs, corruption is an injustice that affects us all. I'd like to now introduce our newly elected chairperson, Mrs. Donna Jack Hill, an accountant with more than 32 years' experience in the field of accounting, treasury operations, and risk management. She possesses qualifications such as ACCA, CPA, and also has an MBA and Bachelor of Science degree. She possesses a strong track record for timely and quality deliverables across these industries, and has led cross-functional teams in problem-solving projects in areas of banking, liquidity risk, and foreign exchange management. She has spent the last 3 years serving as our treasurer at Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute, and the last year as its vice chair. I would now like to ask the current chairman of the Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute to present Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index for 2023.
Thank you, Director Mays. Mr. Ravi Sridhar, Vice Chair, TTTI. Mr. Raj Badlal Joseph, Ombudsman of Trinidad and Tobago. His Excellency Arif Kishani, Canadian High Commissioner, His Excellency Hernan Nunez, Ambassador of the Republic of Chile, Ms. Lizette Bloom, Deputy Head of Mission for the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, other members of the Diplomatic Corps, Mr. David West, Chairman, Police Complaints Authority, representatives of local and international agencies in Trinidad and Tobago, Mrs. Dion Abdul and Victor Ha, past chairs of Transparency, members of the board and members of TTTI, other specially invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted that you have joined Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute as we launch the results of the 2023 Corruption Perceptions Index, the CPI. TTTI is a local chapter of Transparency International, a global civil society organization leading the fight against corruption. TTTI was launched in 1998 by a group of concerned and committed citizens who were deeply troubled by the level of corruption existing in Trinidad and Tobago. Since its formation, TTTI remains an independent, non-political, and non-profit civil society organization governed by a board of directors who are volunteers elected by our members, both individual and corporate. Our work is aimed at reducing corruption and fostering good governance by raising awareness, stimulating action, and contributing to the reform of the public and private sectors. As we gather today to discuss the Corruption Perceptions Index, allow me to first note that the CPI is a world-recognized, accredited indicator which acts as a reference point for investment, business, social, and economic reforms. This year, the CPI theme is corruption and injustice, a subject matter that is relevant and applicable to any jurisdiction. I cannot underscore enough that corruption is detrimental. It diverts much needed resources, financial and otherwise, from those who are in dire need of various public goods and services. Furthermore, Transparency International has highlighted the global trend of weakening justice systems, which is reducing accountability for public officials and allows corruption to thrive. Authoritarian and also many democratic leaders undermining justice are increasing impunity for corruption and even encouraging it by eliminating consequences for criminals. One must note that independent, transparent, and well-resourced judiciaries and law enforcement institutions are central to keeping corruption in check. In turn, preventing the abuse of political power, bribery, and other forms of corruption from influencing justice systems is key to ensuring their effectiveness. Corruption and the rule of law are closely intertwined. When justice can be bought or be politically interfered with, laws stop applying equally to all. They serve private interests rather than the common good and fail to restrain government's powers. Research has shown that countries with independent judiciaries tend to control corruption better as they limit government's powers more effectively. Let's take a look at grand corruption. The reality exists that impaired justice systems are unable to stop grand corruption. The abuse of high-level power that causes serious and widespread suffering in societies. Weak check on government behavior makes it possible for the powerful to disable institutions responsible for overseeing and enforcing the law, producing opportunity for grand corruption offenses. In many countries where high-level officials abuse their power, state institutions are often unwilling or unable to detect grand corruption and take action against such activities. The problem is made worse by many countries regarded as having strong rules of law, failing to bring grand corruption perpetrators to justice, rarely taking legal action against these criminals who launder stolen money there. Furthermore, corruption in the justice system erodes trust and public confidence in the administration and application of justice. It deters honest individuals from reporting crime as they feel that justice will not be served, while also discouraging them from entering public office and the civil service. In most countries, people harmed by corruption generally face many obstacles to achieving justice due to legal and procedural barriers. Furthermore, their voices and claims are seldom heard before, during, or after legal proceedings. Remarkably, since 2013, Trinidad and Tobago Transparency Institute has been operating our Advocacy and Legal Advice Center, ALAC, which provides free support and legal advice to victims and witnesses of corruption. In the coming weeks, TTTI, through grant funding from the United Way Trinidad and Tobago, will be hosting another set of legal clinics throughout Trinidad and Tobago, where a number of free legal services will be afforded to citizens. I strongly believe that we can all agree that when corrupt people weaken justice systems, societies lose their ability to protect and to fulfill the rights of all people, with those already experiencing marginalization being at a particular disadvantage. Since corruption, by definition, benefits some groups or individuals over others, it can also fuel social injustice, as marginalized or vulnerable groups are less likely to benefit from corrupt arrangements and are more likely to bear the cost. Analysis illustrates that the Americas and Caribbean region shows considerable challenges in the fight against corruption. The lack of independence of the judiciary in the region is one of the main problems. It undermines the rule of law and promotes impunity for the powerful and criminals to the detriment of the people and the common good. Sadly, organizations like TTTI are largely underfunded and under-resourced. We view our work as essential and continue to seek valued partnerships with corporate Trinidad and Tobago, the media, other stakeholders, and our members to inject funding and/or resources into our programs, such as School Integrity Club program, which focuses on giving alternatives to our youth and inculcate the right value systems that put integrity and accountability above all else. Our Advocacy and Legal Advice Center, ALAC, as mentioned earlier, that provides legal guidance. Business Integrity Country Agenda Program, as well as our advocacy and lobby campaigns, which seek to improve the business climate and address identified weaknesses in legislation and the way the country conducts its business. As chair, I can tell you, while my board and I work for the love of country, the work we do requires your support. According to Transparency International's chair, Francois Valoran, and I quote, Corruption will continue to thrive until justice systems can punish wrongdoing and keep governments in check. When justice is bought or politically interfered with, it is the people that suffer. Leaders should fully invest in and guarantee the independence of institutions that uphold the law and tackle corruption. It is time to end impunity for corruption, end quote. This goal can only be achieved with sustained, unwavering advocacy, and with each citizen, corporate and individual, seeking ways to contribute to the result we desire. This is an opportune place, an appropriate place, for me to segue into today's main event, the launch of the CPI results. So the CPI scores and ranks countries based on how corrupt a country's public sector is perceived to be by experts and business executives. It is a composite index, which is a combination of up to 13 surveys and assessments of corruption collected from a variety of reputable institutions. The CPI is the most widely used indicator of corruption worldwide. The CPI source data captures the following aspects of corruption based on specific question wording used to collect the data. So it will look at bribery, misuse of public funds or diversion of public funds, prevalence of officials using public office for private gain without facing consequences, the ability of governments to contain corruption and enforce effective integrity mechanisms in the public sector by reducing red tape and excessive bureaucratic burdens, which may increase opportunities for corruption, meritocratic versus nepotistic appointments in the civil service. Effective criminal prosecution for corrupt officials. Adequate laws on financial disclosure and conflict of interest. Prevention for the public officials. Legal protection for whistleblowers, journalists, and investigators when they are investigating reported cases of bribery and corruption. State capture by narrow vested interests and access to civil society to information on public affairs. So what does the CPI not measure, we may ask? Well, the CPI does not capture the following aspects of corruption: citizens' perception or experience of corruption, tax fraud, illicit financial flows, enablers of corruption like lawyers, accountants, financial advisors, money laundering, private sector corruption, and informal economies and markets. The CPI includes only scores that provide a score for a set of countries and that measure expert perceptions of corruption in the public sector. While the maximum number of data sources is 13, a country may have less sources utilized in the calculation based on availability from a particular source. However, a country must have at least 3 data sources for inclusion in the CPI. The sources of information used for the CPI are based on data published in the previous 2 years. This means that CPI 2023 is based on data and analyses of initiatives in 2021 and 2022. And as this slide shows, 180 countries continue to be covered by the CPI. The CPI is calculated using the data sources available from institutions like the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, private risk and consulting companies, think tanks, and others. A country's CPI score is then calculated as the average of all standardized scores available for that country. The scores are rounded to a whole number. The resulting score will be between 0 and 100, with 100 representing very clean and 0 highly corrupt. So the CPI methodology is really a 4-step methodology. The first step involves selection of the sources of data. The second, the rescaling of the source of data to a common scale, as the measurement from the various sources may vary and use different measurement scales. The third step is to aggregate the rescaled data, and finally, report a measure for uncertainty. In this case, in TI's case, standard error. The process for calculating the CPI is reviewed regularly to make sure it is as robust and coherent as possible. The calculation process also incorporates a strict quality control mechanism, which consists of parallel independent calculations conducted by researchers and academic advisors with no affiliation to Transparency International. The Corruption Perception Index results released by Transparency International reveals that most countries have made little to no progress in tackling public sector corruption in more than a decade. Governments are largely failing to stop corruption, as over 80% of the world's population lives in countries with CPI scores below the global average, which this year continues to be 43. The global trend of weakening justice systems is reducing accountability for public officials, which allows corruption to thrive. So let's see who are the top countries, scoring countries in the CPI index this year. Once again, the advanced economies of Northern and Western Europe, North America, and Asia Pacific top the CPI ranking. They tend to have stronger rule of law, well-functioning democratic institutions, and political stability. Ironically, this has made these seemingly clean countries attractive to corrupt officials from around the world when choosing where to launder and invest their ill-gotten gains for safekeeping. As a measure of public sector corruption at the national level, the CPI does not capture the extent to which countries facilitate transnational corruption, be it allowing stolen funds to be laundered through their economies or giving a free pass to companies that bribe foreign officials. This is precisely where these high-scoring countries' main weaknesses lie. For example, the Netherlands, although scoring 79, has a poor record of prosecuting companies that bribe foreign officials. The analysis of past cases of corruption sheds light on the role of accountants and lawyers from top-scoring countries such as Switzerland in enabling cross-border corruption. For far too long, Swiss lawyers have been able to provide service to foreign elites without having a duty to detect money laundering. In a welcome step, the Swiss government last year proposed new legislation to extend anti-money laundering obligations to lawyers and other professionals. Despite some recent progress, countries ranking high on the CPI still are not doing enough to tackle transnational corruption. They must eliminate financial secrecy loopholes, regulate and better supervise professionals such as accountants like myself, real estate agents and lawyers, and hold perpetrators of transnational corruption and their enablers accountable. Let's look at the flip side, the 11 bottom countries: Somalia, Venezuela, Syria, South Sudan, and Yemen take the bottom spots in the index. They are all affected by protracted crises, mostly armed conflicts. On average, democratic countries outperform hybrid or authoritarian regimes in controlling corruption. Full democracies have an average CPI score of 73. Flawed democracies, an average of 48. And non-democratic regimes average just 32. Let's look at the Americas, the group in which Trinidad and Tobago and our Caribbean neighbors are assessed. Here we find Canada and Uruguay at the top of the regional ranking, with more robust checks and balances, while Venezuela, Haiti, and Nicaragua find themselves with the lowest scores, with widespread impunity and a complete lack of independence of the judiciary, with 2/3 of the countries in the region having a score under 50 out of 100 on the Corruption Perceptions Index. The Americas shows considerable challenges in the fight against corruption. The lack of independence of the judiciary in the region was cited as one of the main problems. On a positive note, 2 countries in the region, Guyana and the Dominican Republic, have experienced statistically significant movement in their CPI scores over the past decade of 11 and 7 points respectively. So it's important to acknowledge some good news. So let's look at the Caribbean. The CPI results for the Caribbean illustrates that these countries have made little to no progress. Remarkably, Barbados was able to improve by 4 points, which is a notable step in the right direction. All of the other countries have either remained the same or moved up 1 point, and in the case of Venezuela, down 1 point. I'm sure if you're looking for Trinidad and Tobago in this slide, you would notice that we are not in the Caribbean result. That's because we decided we would pull Trinidad and Tobago out for special examination. So this year, remember, we spoke about data sources earlier, and we spoke about 13 data sources possible. For our CPI score this year, there were 6 data sources used. The first, well, one of them, I shouldn't call them in any order because they're not used in any order, but one was the Bertelsmann Foundation Transformation Index, Economic Intelligence Unit Country Rating, the Global Insights Country Risk Rating, the Political Risk Service International Country Risk Guide, Varieties of Democratic Project, and the World Justice Project Rule of Law Index. So these were our 6 data sources which were utilized to compute our score. Let us remind ourselves of our CPI score over the last 4 years, 2019 to 2022. As you can see, this can be described as a slow movement upward, but not statistically significant. Our big interest today is whether we continued on this path or whether we stumbled. In 2023, for the second consecutive year, Trinidad and Tobago's CPI score is 42. Considering 50 as the pass grade out of 100, we need to do much better. Greater effort is needed for us to combat the perception of corruption in this country. So what's the way forward, you may ask? This year's analysis for the Corruption Perceptions Index found that weakened judicial systems globally to be the cause for concern, and many of the recommendations of the report centered around the urgent need to build more robust and independent judiciary where appointments and dismissals are transparent and based on experience and performance. Honest judges and prosecutors have the guarantee to conduct their work without interference, and where proper resources and greater international cooperation between independent prosecutors from different jurisdictions exist to promote and sanction transnational corruption. There's a need to implement efficient, prompt, and thorough investigation of corruption and ensure that these investigations are serious, aimed at obtaining results, and that they respect judicial guarantees under the protection of due process and broad defense, both in administrative and judicial venues. We should, victims of corruption are at the center of the fight against this phenomenon and are part of the analysis, diagnosis, design, and implementation of mechanisms, practice, policies, and strategies to prevent, punish, and eradicate corruption, considering the principles of non-discrimination and equality, accountability, access to justice, transparency, and participation. We need to implement mechanisms aimed at protecting witnesses and victims of corruption. Our country desperately needs whistleblower legislation, and I call on all members of Parliament to support the passage and implementation of the Whistleblower Protection Bill when it is laid again in Parliament. Let me take this opportunity as chair of TTTI's Board of Directors to again publicly call for campaign finance legislation to be brought to Parliament, proclaimed and enforced as promised ahead of the upcoming general elections. At present, Trinidad and Tobago does not have a real or proper regulatory system in place for the acquisition or expenditure of financial resources acquired by political parties to contest elections. We need to make inroads at the policy and operational levels if we are to be successful in the fight against corruption. I encourage all sectors of society to work together with TTTI to build a safer, more equitable, and ethical society. The Board of Directors and Secretariat are committed to this fight, but we need you to help us achieve a corruption-free society. So what can you do? Become a member of TTTI. Donate, volunteer. We need you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I now pass back over to Director Mays.
Thank you. We now come to the segment where persons in attendance may field questions to the presenters. You may do so by raising your hand, and you may then, your mic will then be unmuted, and you may field your question to either Mrs. Donna Jack Hill, the chair, or Mr. Rajman Lal Joseph, the ombudsman. I'm seeing a hand raised. Kanika, could you unmute? Unfortunately, not able to see who the participant is. Please, when you're unmuted, if you can introduce yourself.
I allow the mic, Sean.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm recognizing Kim.
Hello?
Yes. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Sorry, I think I'm not managing Microsoft Teams as well. I'm so accustomed to Zoom. I apologize to everyone on the panel.
We're all having difficulties. Yeah.
Mujram from the Express. I was also not prepared for video. And good afternoon to chair and featured speaker. So I do have a couple of questions. I'm going to try to articulate everything at once without being too long-winded. And I mean, my questions would be addressed to the chair or to Mr. Joseph, both of whom raised points related to what I wanted to ask in terms of our socio-cultural approach to corruption. I mean, our government, the members of our government come from our society, and Mr. Joseph did speak at length in a way that sort of answered the question. But I think what I wanted to really bring it to a point, and especially for a layperson, you know, what is it? One, what is the citizens' participation and what is available to them, and how can a citizen really hone in on their ability to participate in beginning to stamp out corruption? And we see that constitutional reform talks are supposed to be in the works with the advisory committee that Dr. Rowley, the Prime Minister, appointed. And so if any of the speakers want to comment on that as well as related to especially like the ability of citizens to begin to put some more control as far as they want to see on corruption in their government, but then the citizens as well. And I don't want to pronounce on us, but our attitude also has to be one of wanting to do that work and maintain that work. And that really ties into the socio-cultural acceptance almost of Bobol as a joke to an extent that are we really seriously tackling the issue? And I also wanted very quickly to ask if any of if the chair or maybe Mr. Joseph would want to comment on the exchanges that we saw recently between the Prime Minister and the Integrity Commission, you know, including its former chair, Dr. Dr. Jendra Ramlogan, and how, you know, their thoughts on how that exchange, a reflection on the institute, on the society, on the government. I'll stop there because I can always ask again. I hope I was kind of clear in what I was getting at. Thank you.
Let me briefly respond to the question raised by the speaker, particularly the interplay between the Prime Minister and the former chairman of the Integrity Commission. I was a bit taken aback by those exchanges, simply because the Integrity Commission is established by the Constitution. And one would have thought that a significant amount of concern would have entered the mind of the then president when making that appointment. And if a prime minister has difficulties with utterances, with reports, or the approach of the Integrity Commission, there are acceptable channels by which that message could be communicated, other than going on Facebook making public pronouncements. Whenever these things happen and public officials are negatively treated in the media, there's very little that the public official could do to respond effectively to statements made by significant political office holders, like, for instance, the Prime Minister, Attorney General, cabinet ministers. And therefore, it lowers in the estimation by the ordinary citizens of these institutions, which leads to institutional degradation. That is something that we ought not to tolerate. One of the hallmarks of most of the countries that score very high on the index is that they have institutions that work. And it is in this way that the citizens develop the type of commitment to ensure that corruption is not widespread, because there is an institutional framework to deal with the complaints of citizens. I trust that that sheds a little light.
Yeah, I'm seeing that the Ombudsman dealt so thoroughly with the Integrity Commission question. I just want to say that sometimes we should not be afraid of these confrontations. They are part of the growing pains of our country, and it tests the rigor of these institutions and their ability to stand up to scrutiny. So we shouldn't be afraid of it. We look at it sometimes with some reservations, but in the end, I think it augurs well in terms of building the capacity and the rigor of these institutions. But I want to go to the first part of your question, which talks about how can citizens contribute to the anti-corruption environment. And I think generally there's a sense of powerlessness when I speak to members of my own cohort about what they can do about corruption. But I think we all have a role to play wherever we sit in the organizations we work in the interactions we have with members of the public at whatever level we interact with them. Because I often say for there to be a bribe, there has to be a briber and a bribee. And, and we have to see how we stand up and how we test our own value systems when we are faced with an opportunity to take a stand and to do something. And I often say that as a country, we don't have a movement against anti-corruption. If we add our voices together, the collective voice will cause change. And so that's why TTTI often calls on members of the public and our own members to join with us whenever there is a movement, an advocacy for change and against any action that we think is not in the public good. So we really have to have a movement, which is what we're calling for, a strong force of public voices against corruption in our society.
Thank you, presenters. Do we have any other questions from the media or from persons in attendance? Please raise your hand, your virtual hand, and you will be unmuted. Yes, Ms. Budram, I see you've raised your hand again.
Hi again. Good afternoon again. So just to follow up on all of that, if anyone wanted to talk about the constitutional reform exercise that is coming up and how you all feel about that and how you would like, well, maybe I don't want to ask maybe how you would like to see it go, but I guess, things that you think are important about that exercise that, must be covered. And also it's difficult to ask anyone to say, well, where we should have been or ought to have been in 2024, as opposed to where we are, you know, developmental wise as a country, based on the kind of wealth that would have passed through the country and that the relation of that to corruption. I mean, you know, people we like to compare to other countries and say we should have been like Singapore or Dubai or whatever. But I do want to ask if any of the speakers want to sort of put a grade on, you know, where Trinidad and Tobago maybe ought to have been. It could be wherever in some industry. It could just be the overall development or something more that we should see in 2024, given our energy wealth for one thing and how we handled it, and the relation of corruption to that. Thank you. I think that might be it for me.
Certainly, and certainly there have been some developments legislatively, such as procurement legislation. And I'll ask Ms. Donna Jackhill to address that question.
Well, I think the crystal ball is for the future, and you're asking me to predict where we should have been as a country, and I guess hindsight is always 2020. And so I would not like to hazard a guess as to, I mean, we would all like to be at the top of our region, scoring 100, being the cleanest country in the world. That is our aspiration as TTTI, to have a society where we are corruption-free. But that also requires that as a society, we really do have a high level of disgust for corruption. And so that really, regardless of how much money is passing through our country, I think has to be the underlying culture that we cultivate. Whether we have a lot of money or we don't have a lot of money, that is the underlying culture, that we have a low tolerance for corruption. And so when our fortunes change and we have a lot of money, that continues to be the culture that pervades. I don't know if that specifically answers your question, but that is our thrust as the Institute in Trinidad and Tobago.
Ombudsman, would you like to address that question as well?
No, what I would like to do is to address the issue of constitutional reform. And one of the difficulties with the existing constitutional arrangements and how it impacts on corruption. As most people would know, the existing constitution does not have a strict separation of powers doctrine in operation. It is partial. And I say that because the executive really controls the legislature. In order for you to form a government, you have to have a simple majority in parliament. All it takes to pass a money bill is a simple majority. And once the government has a simple majority, the executive controls their members in the House, and therefore they could get money bills passed easily. If you had a strict separation of powers doctrine operational, then you would not have that interlocking between the executive and the legislature. They would both be separate and distinct. Of course, we have always had a fairly decent judiciary, and it has exemplified its independence, particularly in the area of public law, where judges have pronounced authoritatively on the constitutional rights of citizens. So I don't have a difficulty with that. Another thing that commentators are not focusing on is that the many constitutional commissions we have had in this country, one of the most important being the Woodin Commission. I don't know if people remember, the Woodin Commission majority report was rejected by the government, and the minority Senate report was accepted because it supported the status quo. So I just thought I would throw this out for the questioner and suggest that in going forward with any constitutional reform mechanism, it may be useful to examine what took place in the past with the various commissions, particularly the Woodin Commission and the Hayatali Commission. I don't know if that helps the questioner.
I think, yeah, no, thank you. I think that both answers, I think, cover my question very well. Thanks, and point to maybe how we approach the thing. Thank you.
Thank you to Ms. Bodram from the Express. Are there any further questions before we close?
I'm seeing a question here from Carissa Lee in the chat, Director. And Carissa is asking, you call for parliamentarians to support the whistleblower legislation. Do you think, if supported, that this will make a dent in in Trinidad and Tobago's CPI score and rating? We have to advocate for to close all these legislative gaps, but even more important, I think, is once we get the legislation in place, it's operationalizing and utilizing it and it having some kind of efficacy in terms of getting us the information that we need to pursue corrupt actions in the society. So that is just the first step towards getting to a better place in an anti-corruption environment. So I don't want to say that it's going to be the be all and end all, but it is the first step, and operationalizing it and utilizing it in order to unearth corruption will be really where the ultimate metal is going to hit the road.
Thank you. Are there any other questions in the chat, or if not, I would like to ask our Vice Chair, Mr. Ravi Suryadevara, to give a vote of thanks and his closing remarks.
Good morning. All protocols observed. Thank you, Director Mahias. Firstly, very heartfelt thanks to our keynote speaker, the Ombudsman, Mr. Rajman Lal Joseph, not only for very illuminating presentations, perhaps where we can draw attention in common areas of advocacy on improvement, but also highlighting the role and function of the Ombudsman so that we can better position that advocacy. More importantly, I think it'll be apt to say the example of your life and your public service, the potency of your forthrightness this morning in fielding questions, for myself, has been very uplifting, as I am sure it has been for the entire viewing audience and members present. For this, a sincere vote of thanks, not only for your presence this morning and sharing your time, but your continued public service and the guidance your public service provides for us all. To our chair and her illuminating remarks this morning and her call for actioning the whistleblower legislation when tabled next, and highlighting the requirement for campaign finance reform, amongst a plethora of other things legislatively afforded to us to be advocated on. Heartfelt thank you. But above all else, again, the strong call and resounding argument placed for the necessity for civil society organizations in answering Ms. Bodram's question, how can citizens engage? Sometimes we must engage through entities such as Trinidad and Tobago Transparency International, and there are others. It is going to require collaboration. It is going to require collective will, and the examples of lives such as Mr. Rajman Lal Joseph in public service to guide us. I will add my own personal thanks to the diplomatic corps, especially invited guests, members of the viewing public, for taking the time to witness this morning's proceedings and bear witness to some of the dialogue. As a refresher point, that to a point the chair raised, it may feel that the fight against corruption is a fight that's lonely. But as my own personal history guides me, there are a lot more that feel this way. And the question posed to us, and how do we engage, is an age-old one. I do think it all simply starts by simply getting involved, small steps. Corruption is not a static, discrete phenomenon. Corruption is not limited to government or public entities. Corruption is a modality that must be dealt with through our core values, our way of life. And I constantly reason with myself that we are still a young country in the scheme of things, figuring out what it means to govern ourselves. We are our own harshest critics, and maybe that at times adds to the impedance, but I think the press has guided the proceedings this morning in closing. Not only how do we improve our showing in the CPI, but the path ahead to how we may engage and the things we may engage around. On behalf of TTTI's chair, Mrs. Donna Jack Hill, the board of directors, our secretariat, members, myself, especially invited guest colleagues, I wish you all a safe day, continued well-being, and looking forward to your support and engagement at the next event. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.